Good morning, anatomy students. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 4 notes, and these are our objectives. We want to be able to describe the structure and function of tissues, including differentiate between body tissues, including epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. This set of notes actually only discusses epithelial, and then the next set will go through connective, muscle, and nervous. We need to be able to discuss characteristics and functions of epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissues, and examine epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous histology characteristics in lab. We'll be doing that tomorrow and Thursday. All right, our introduction to body tissues. Your tissues are composed of specialized cells of similar structure and perform a common function. That should be familiar from your very first quiz of the year. And there are four major types that we're going to learn about, and there's a mnemonic to help you. Epithelial covers, connective connects, muscular contracts, and nervous communicates. So hopefully that will help you remember those four. These, our organs in our body are typically composed of all four types, and we'll get there a little bit later in the year. All right, to start, we're going to focus on the general characteristics of our epithelial tissues. These cells are tightly packed. They protect the external and internal body surfaces. They're also going to secrete and absorb substances, and they will readily divide to replace lost or damaged cells. When people think of epithelial tissue, a lot of times they think of skin, which is a simple example that you're familiar with. These cells are avascular, or lack a blood supply, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. They also have a free surface and a basement membrane. So there's one side of the tissue that is attached and one side that is not, and that's called the free surface. Now, the last one is that they are classified by cell shape and the number of cell layers. So here's our image, and up top you can see that we have the apical or free surface. So here's our epithelial cells, and we'll talk about the shape of these in a minute. So here's a basement membrane, and that's basically just the membrane that's attaching them to the connective tissue below. So epithelial cells are attached on one side to connective tissue below, and the basement membrane is what makes that connection. We said that that is avascular. That means it does not have a blood supply. So the top epithelial cells are not where your blood vessels are. You'll see down here at the bottom, this red part is the blood vessel. And I don't know if you've ever had a paper cut where you did not bleed. Sometimes you'll cut yourself with a paper cut and you think, man, that hurts, but no blood comes out. That's because you have not broken into the connective tissue down below. You were just in the epithelial cells. And you'll notice this yellow nerve does come up in between those epithelial cells. So you'd be able to feel the cut, but you would not bleed. All right, so we are going to classify these with a number of cell layers. It can either be simple, which means one layer, or stratified, which means more than one. And they're also classified by shape. So squamous has flattened cells, and one of my students suggested that it sounds like the word squished, and the cells do look like they have been squished. The cuboidal epithelium has cube-shaped cells. I think that term is pretty straightforward. And then columnar epithelium has elongated cells like columns on a building, up and down. So those are fairly simple to identify as well. So here's a picture that does a good job of showing you this. You have two choices. It can be simple, which is one layer, or it can be stratified, more than one layer, and it's usually pretty obvious. Squamous is when they're flattened and squished. Cuboidal is when they look like a cube. Now, my comment about cuboidal and columnar, they are not going to look like a perfect drawing when you look at pictures or images under the microscope. When we are dealing with real living creatures, even though they are sort of like a cube in cuboidal, they're probably not going to look like perfect little Legos. So just keep in mind that when we're looking through the microscope, if it looks sort of like a cube, that's good enough. Columnar, they are elongated up and down. And again, they're not going to be exact, perfect rectangles, but you are going to notice that elongated shape. All right, so squamous epithelium has a single layer of flattened cells, simple squamous does, and the important thing I want you to get out of this is looking at the function. Why do we have these cells? We have them for filtration, diffusion, and osmosis. It's a very thin layer, so if things need to be able to pass through it, this is a perfect tissue for that purpose. There is another choice for squamous epithelium. You can have stratified squamous, and stratified has many cell layers, and the shape of the deeper cells may be cuboidal or columnar. So when we're going to name a shape, we're going to look at that top layer. We're not going to look at the basement layer. So shape of outer cells are flattened and squamous shaped, found in the outer portion of the skin and body orifices. So here is an example of your stratified squamous epithelium, and it has lots and lots of layers here. And when we looked at our cheek cells under the microscope, this is what you were looking at. You scraped those cheek cells off with the toothpick gently, and they came right off, and your mouth didn't bleed or hurt because there are so many layers there. So that's why the inside of your mouth would have that many layers, because as you're chewing and eating, you want those to be protective. And here's another example, which is the palm of your hand. And again, we see a function, protection from injury. All of these layers and layers of cells are going to protect you as you go throughout your day, picking things up, carrying them. Your skin has to be very protective. All right, a second type is the cuboidal epithelium. And in this example, it's a single layer of cube-shaped cells attached to a basement membrane. And again, we're going to look at the function. Why do we have this? For secretion or absorption, it's a single layer. So if it needs to absorb something or secrete something, there's not very far to go, unlike those stratified squamous that were for protection. If you have stratified cuboidal epithelium, it will often only have 2 layers, and hint, hint, you might see an image of this later. It's found lining the larger ducts of certain glands. Simple columnar epithelium is the next type, and these cells are longer than they are wide, so they're going to look like columns on a building up and down, and sometimes they're modified to perform specific functions. So you may see some cells called goblet cells. Right here you can see the cartoon version of it. Here you can see the actual photograph, and those are meant to secrete mucus. A lot of times it's mucus, and you're going to find them in digestive organs so that they will be secreting that mucus, or you may find them in the respiratory system as well. And hopefully you'll see a few more examples here. Again, we're really focusing on the functions. Why do we have these? Protection, secretion, absorption. All right. Sometimes instead of having stratified cells, like in obvious layers, you're going to have something called pseudostratified. Pseudo means sort of. It says it appears to have more than one layer, but only has one true layer because each cell touches the basement membrane. So this is a little bit trickier. Here's an example. It says pseudostratified ciliated columnar. We're going to look at an example about the air passageways of the respiratory system, and often they will have the goblet cells in the cilia. So here's your example. This is lining that respiratory tract, and at the top you have cilia, those little hair-like structures that are kind of sweeping things, helping them to move through. And you also see these goblet cells. So when you look at this picture, I want to make sure you see the cilia at the top. Notice that. Those goblet cells kind of showing you that they're columnar. And then if you look at the cartoon, it does a good job of showing you that those cells do go all the way to the basement membrane, even though it sort of looks like there's more than one layer. All right, transitional epithelium, you're going to see an example of in lab tomorrow, and it changes. There are areas in your body that have to change shape. They will stretch and recoil afterwards. And so here's an example, the urinary bladder. Sometimes it is full and sometimes it is empty, and that epithelial tissue has to be able to respond to that. And you'll see an example of that tomorrow in lab. All right, so this does a good job of summarizing for us the different tissues that we talked about, their description, what they're going to look like, and their location. Their location is related to their function, so you need to know what these cells do, why they are placed where they are. All right, and you don't have this in your notes, but we're going to practice right now. I'm going to show you some pictures, and I want you to try to identify what type it might be. I hope you said that this looks like simple squamous, and remember that they are for lining or absorption, diffusion across a thin layer of cells. Next one. Hopefully you identified these as simple columnar cells. If you look over to the right, you can see they all go up and down, and I'm not seeing even what looks like layers, so I think we would go simple on this. They also have these goblet cells that have been modified to secrete something. Since we're looking at the intestines, I'm going to assume it's secreting mucus. When we look at this image, the cells that they want you to identify are along this opening right here. Remember that epithelial cells all have one free edge that's open and then an edge that's attached. So this would be the free edge and this would be the basement membrane over here where it's attached. And hopefully you said that this is a simple cuboidal cells. This is coming from the pancreas, and simple cuboidal cells, remember, one of their things they can do is secrete. All right. I think that it's obvious that these are columnar. Hopefully you also notice that they are ciliated. And the purpose of cilia is for movement, and if you look at their location, this would be for movement of an egg. Okay, so this was a little trickier one. Hopefully you said that these are pseudo-stratified. It sort of looks like they're in layers, but if you were to look at it in detail, you would see that they do actually go all the way from the free layer down to the basement membrane. So it's a little trickier, but this is pseudo-stratified, and up at the top we have the cilia, so you would say ciliated. Remember, that's also for movement. All right, and when we're looking at this image, we're looking at these purple cells. And when we think about cell shape, we need to identify it from those top layers, not from the basement membrane. So hopefully you would say this is squamous, and it looks like there's lots of layers here, so I would call that stratified squamous. Remember, that lines and protects. All right, up next, these cells, it looks like there's more than one layer, and I would call them cuboidal. And here we have more than one layer, and you judge from the apical or free surface the shape, so I would call these columnar. Right? And that's the end of your notes. Tomorrow in lab we'll be looking at all of these examples under the microscopes. Make sure you ask questions, and I will see you later.